nobody wanted. Clara had 30 minutes to pack. She knew because her father set the kitchen timer on the shelf above the stove. The little brass one her mother had brought from Virginia, and he set it without looking at her. He set it the way a man sets a timer for bread. Like something routine. Like she wasn't standing 3 feet away from him, with her heart splitting clean down the middle. 30 minutes is plenty, he said. You don't own much. I wasn't wrong. That was the worst part. After 31 years of living in that house, of waking before sunrise to feed livestock, of mending fences in weather that cracked skin, of cooking meals. Her father ate without comment and sometimes without sitting down. After all of it, Clara Bennett could fit her life into one canvas bag and still have room left over. She didn't argue with him. She never argued with him. What was the point? Thomas Bennett had been arguing with life itself for 20 years, ever since Clara's mother died, and life had been winning steadily. The ranch was failing. The debts were stacked like cordwood against the barn wall. The men in town had stopped extending credit 6 months ago, and Thomas had turned to a card table in the back of McKinley's saloon to solve the problem the way desperate men always do, by making it worse. Clara walked to her room, pulled the canvas bag from under her bed, and started folding clothes. Her hands were steady. That surprised her. She'd expected them to shake. She packed 2 wool dresses, both dark brown. A pair of heavy boots already cracked at the left heel. Her mother's small Bible, the leather worn soft as skin from years of handling. A tin of dried herbs she'd gathered herself. Yarrow, bark dried comfrey. Because Clara had been the nearest thing to a doctor this part of Montana had seen since old Dr. Haverfield passed 2 winters back. A bar of lye soap. 2 pairs of stockings. And at the very bottom of the bag, tucked beneath everything else, like a secret, a single folded letter she'd written to herself on her 25th birthday, and never sent to anyone because there was no one to send it to. The timer went off before she finished. Her father was standing at the front door when she came back down the hall. He had his hat on. He was holding a lantern. He didn't look at the bag. He didn't look at her face. "He's waiting at the gate," Thomas said. "You could have asked me." "It wouldn't have changed anything." "It would have changed something," Clara said. Her voice was very quiet. "It would have meant you thought of me as a person first." Thomas Bennett looked at his boots. "I'm sorry it came to this, Clara." "What did you lose?" she asked. "How much?" He was quiet for long enough that she had her answer. "Everything," he finally said. "Everything that was left." Clara picked up her bag. "Then I hope the cards were worth it." She walked past him and out the door, and she did not look back at the house. Elias Boone was exactly what the town said he was at first glance. He was tall and lean in the way that men get lean after years of hard country, not thin, but stripped down, the way a piece of wood gets stripped by weather until only the hardest part remains. He wore a dark coat and a battered hat, and the horse beneath him was the kind of animal that doesn't shift or stamp because it doesn't need to. He sat in the dark at the gate of the Bennett property, and he watched Clara walk toward him without moving a muscle. She stopped a few feet from the horse. He looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Mrs. Boone," she said. "If we're doing this, we might as well do it right." Something shifted in his expression. It was very small. She almost missed it. "Fair enough," he said. "Can you ride?" "I've been riding since I was 4 years old. There's a second horse tied back here." He jerked his chin toward the shadow behind him, and Clara walked around to find a sturdy brown mare waiting patiently in the cold. She checked the cinch, adjusted the stirrup without asking for help, and swung herself up with the ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times. Elias watched all of this without comment. Then he turned his horse north toward the mountains, and Clara followed. They rode for 3 hours in silence. The cold was the kind that gets inside clothing and sits there, but Clara had grown up in Montana winters, and she'd learned long ago not to give cold the satisfaction of acknowledgement. She focused instead on the terrain, on memorizing landmarks in the dark, the shape of a particular rock formation, the bend in a frozen creek, the way the pines thickened as the elevation climbed. She was calculating. She always calculated. It was the habit of a woman who had learned early that no one else would calculate for her. Elias spoke when they were about an hour from the cabin without turning around. People in town say things about me, he said. I figure you heard them. I heard them, Clara said. Which ones? That you killed men in the war. That you live with wolves. That you buried bodies on your property. The first one's true, he said without any particular emotion. The second one's an exaggeration. There's one wolf that comes around the barn sometimes, and I leave meat out for her. The third one is a lie somebody made up to scare off a land buyer I didn't want on my property, and it worked, so I let it stand. Clara considered that. You let people think you're a murderer to protect your land. People think what they want to think. I've stopped correcting it. That's not the same as letting it stand. Maybe not, he said. They rode in silence again for a while. People in town say things about me too, Clara said eventually. He didn't answer right away. Then, I know what they say. And I'm not marrying their opinion of you, he said. I'm marrying you. Clara said nothing to that. She filed it away in a place inside herself that she didn't visit often because that place was where she kept things that were too fragile to look at too directly. The cabin was bigger than she'd expected. She'd built a picture of it in her mind during the ride, something dark and half-collapsed. The kind of place that matched the stories. But what she found when they came around the last stand of pines was a solid square-built structure with a covered porch and light coming from the two front windows. Not warm exactly, but honest. It looked like a place that had been built by someone who intended to stay. Elias dismounted first and tied both horses before Clara had her boot out of the stirrup, but he didn't reach up to help her down. She noticed that. He waited. Let her do it herself. It was a small thing, but it wasn't nothing. Inside the cabin was simple and clean, in the way that bachelor homes sometimes are when the man who keeps them isn't interested in mess. There was a stone fireplace with a good fire going. He'd banked it before he left. She realized planned ahead, and a table with 2 chairs and a cast-iron pot hanging over the coals that smelled like venison and root vegetables. Clara stood just inside the door with her bag over her shoulder and looked around. There's a room upstairs, Elias said, setting his coat on a peg by the door. It's yours. The latch works. I sleep down here. She turned to look at him. You're my wife by law, he said. What happens after that is your choice. For a moment, Clara didn't know what to do with that. In 31 years, almost no one had ever handed her a choice and meant it. She'd had choices the way a river has choices. The banks were always there, shaping the direction, making the decision for you. But the way he said it was plain and flat, and absolutely without performance. He wasn't being noble. He was simply stating what he believed to be true. Thank you, she said, because she didn't know what else to say. You hungry? Yes. Sit down. He ladled stew into a bowl and set it in front of her without ceremony, then sat across the table with his own bowl and ate in silence. Clara ate too. It was good stew seasoned carefully, the vegetables cut right, the venison tender. She didn't comment on it because she had the feeling he would find compliments about cooking embarrassing. And she was right, though, she didn't know that yet. The well's around the left side of the cabin, he said when they were nearly finished. Freezes sometimes in deep cold. I've got a method for breaking the ice I'll show you in the morning. The barn is 40 feet from the back door. I've got 2 horses, 4 goats, a dozen chickens, and a mule named Patterson, who is the worst-tempered animal in 3 counties and will try to bite you every single time you go near him. Why do you keep him? He's the strongest animal I've ever owned, and he's never once gotten sick. Elias looked up from his bowl. I don't get rid of things just because they're difficult. Clara looked at him steadily. Is that a general philosophy? It's worked so far, he said. She almost smiled. She stopped herself, but not in time, and she saw him notice. After supper, she carried her bag upstairs. The room was small, a bed, a chest, a window that looked out toward the pines, but the mattress was decent, and there were 2 heavy blankets folded at the foot of the bed, and someone had set a small oil lamp on the chest with a box of matches beside it. Clara lit the lamp, latched the door, and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without moving. She thought about her father setting the kitchen timer. She thought about the way the lantern light had looked on the ink of her name. She thought about 31 years of being the wrong size, the wrong shape, the wrong temperament, the wrong everything. of standing in church and feeling the weight of other women's eyes moving over her like an assessment, of hearing more times than she could count, the particular kind of pity that sounds almost like kindness until you realize it's really just contempt with better manners. Too big, too quiet, too useful to be romantic, and too unfeminine to be marriageable. Clara Bennett, who ran a ranch and knew herbal medicine and could calculate feed ratios in her head, and had once set her own dislocated shoulder without making a sound. Clara Bennett, who was, according to the women of Hargrove, Montana, simply too much of everything that didn't matter, and not enough of everything that did. And now she was here, in a room she hadn't chosen, in a marriage she hadn't agreed to, in a cabin in the mountains, with a man who had, in the space of one evening, fed her, given her a safe room, and told her that what happened next was her choice. She reached into her bag and pulled out her mother's Bible. She set it on the chest beside the lamp. Then she reached in again and found the folded letter, the one she'd written to herself at 25, in a moment of something that was maybe hope, maybe grief. She'd never been able to tell the difference entirely, and she held it without opening it. She didn't cry. She'd promised herself she wouldn't. But it was a near thing. Morning came fast in the mountains, and Clara was up before Elias. She found the kitchen by instinct and had coffee on before she fully registered that she was doing it. Old habit. 20 years of being the first one awake in a household where no one thanked you for it. Elias came downstairs to find her standing at the stove with a cup in her hand, looking out the window at the snow-covered pines, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway for a moment. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted coffee. I made enough for two." He poured himself a cup. He stood on the opposite side of the kitchen. There was about 6 feet of space between them, and neither of them moved to reduce it. "I need to check the trap lines this morning," he said. "You can come if you want, or stay, either way." "I'll come," she said. "I want to learn the land." Something in his expression shifted again, that same small movement she'd noticed at the gate. "Most people find the mountain hard in winter." "I grew up in Montana," she said. "Winter is just weather." He looked at her for a moment, like he was recalibrating something. Then he nodded. "Dress warm. We leave in 20 minutes. She was ready in 15, and he was watching the clock when she came out, and whatever he was thinking when he saw that he kept to himself. The trap lines took them 3 hours to walk. Elias checked each trap methodically, reset what needed resetting, noted what he'd caught. He didn't talk much, but what he said was useful, and Clara listened carefully and asked 2 questions that made him pause and give her longer answers than he'd planned. She was mapping the terrain again in her head, memorizing it, how the land sat where the water ran, which direction the wind came from. Not because she was planning to leave, because knowing the land you're on is the first step toward not being afraid of it. "You know plants," Elias said, watching her crouch beside a cluster of dried stems at the base of a boulder. "Some." She touched the stems carefully. "This is yarrow. It's good for bleeding. I've got some dried in my bag, but fresh is better in summer. Haverfield used to come up here for supplies sometimes," he said, "before he died." "I know. He taught me some of it." Clara straightened. "I've been doing most of the doctoring in Hargrove for the past 2 years, unofficially." "Why unofficially?" "Because no one wanted to officially acknowledge that the fat woman who smelled like herbs knew more about wound care than the nearest real doctor, who is 40 miles south and charges 3 months of wages for a house visit." She said it plainly, without bitterness, just fact, the way she said most things. Elias was quiet for a moment. "You ever lose anyone you were trying to help?" "Yes," she said. "Twice. Both times there was nothing to be done, and I knew it, but I stayed anyway." He looked at her steadily. "Why?" "Because dying alone is worse than dying," she said. "I figured the least I could do was make sure they knew there was someone there." Elias didn't say anything to that. He turned and started walking the next section of trapline, and Clara fell into step beside him, and the snow came down around them very quietly. And for a long stretch of that cold morning, neither of them said a word, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was, Clara realized, the first silence she'd been inside in years that didn't feel like she was being ignored. It felt instead like being allowed to simply exist, She didn't know what to do with that either. So she filed it away in the fragile place beside the other thing he'd said and kept walking. That evening she cooked supper, a simple meal from what she found in his larder: dried beans and salt pork and some wild onions she'd spotted near the creek and pocketed on the way back. She didn't ask permission. She found what was there and made something from it, which was what she had always done. Elias sat at the table and watched her work without comment until she set the bowl in front of him. He tasted it. "This is better than what I made last night," he said. "It's the onion," she said. "I didn't know that was edible." "Most things are edible if you know how to prepare them," she said. "That's basically the whole of what I know about surviving." He almost smiled. She saw it at the corner of his mouth, quick as a shadow, gone before it landed. She filed that away too. She was collecting these small things, these tiny contradictions between the man the town described and the man who fixed the fire and remembered the well and left meat for a lone wolf and said, "What happens after that is your choice," and she was building something from them. She didn't know yet what it was. It was too early to call it trust. It was too complicated to call it safety. But it was something. And for Clara Bennett, something had always been enough to keep going. Outside, the January wind hit the walls of the cabin, and the snow thickened against the windows, and the mountains rose around them, dark and enormous, and inside in the warmth. Two people who had each been told in different ways by different voices that they were too difficult to love, sat across a table from each other and ate in the kind of quiet that isn't empty. That night, lying in her room with the lamp turned low, Clara pressed her hand flat against the wall and felt the solid weight of it beneath her palm. Stone and timber. Built to last. She thought, maybe this isn't what I wanted. Then she thought, maybe I never knew what I wanted because I spent my whole life being told what I was instead. She blew out the lamp. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she slept through the night. The second week was harder than the first, and Clara hadn't expected that. The first week had the structure of strangeness to carry it. Everything was new. Everything required attention, and attention kept the other feelings at a manageable distance. But the second week, the newness wore thin in places, and what showed through underneath was the reality of two people trying to occupy the same space without bumping into each other's wounds. It was the little things that caught her off guard. The way Elias went completely still when a sound startled him. Not tense, the way an animal gets tense but frozen, like something in him went somewhere else for a few seconds before coming back. The way he sometimes stood at the window after dark for 20 minutes without moving or speaking. The way he'd started a sentence once at breakfast and then stopped in the middle of it and never finished, and Clara had waited and he hadn't continued, and she'd let it go because she knew what it was to have sentences you couldn't finish. She was watching him more than she meant to. She noticed that too, and it unsettled her because Clara Bennett had spent 31 years training herself not to look at things she couldn't afford to want. On the 9th morning, she found blood on the kitchen floor. Not a lot. A trail of it, dark drops on the wood leading from the back door to the basin by the far wall. She followed it with her eyes and found Elias at the basin. His back to her, his right sleeve rolled to the elbow, pressing a cloth against his forearm with the focused, unhurried efficiency of a man who had done this before. "What happened?" she said. "Trap spring. Caught the edge of my arm when I was resetting it." "Let me see it." "It's fine." "You've got blood on my floor," she said, "which means I'm already involved. Let me see it." He turned slowly the way a man turns when he's debating whether being stubborn is worth the effort, and held out his arm. The cut was deep enough to need closing. Not dangerous, she'd seen far worse, but not something a cloth was going to fix. "Sit down," she said. "Clara, sit down." He sat. She got her tin of supplies from upstairs. She'd reorganized the herbs and added a needle and thread and clean strips of linen in the first week. Because she'd known the way, she always knew that it was only a matter of time. She came back down and sat across from him and took his arm in both hands and looked at the cut properly. "This is going to hurt," she said. "I know. You're going to want to pull away." "I won't." "Most men say that." "I'm not most men." She looked up at him over his forearm. He looked back at her with that flat, steady gaze that she'd come to understand wasn't coldness. It was just the face of a man who'd learned to hold very still when things got difficult. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back down and started cleaning the wound. He didn't pull away. He didn't make a sound. His jaw went tight once briefly, and his other hand closed into a fist on his knee, but that was all. Clara worked quickly and cleanly the way Haverfield had taught her, and when she was done stitching, she wrapped the arm in linen and tied it off with a knot that would hold. "You've done that before," Elias said. "Many times." "Not just herbs, then." "Not just herbs." She put her supplies back in the tin. "I set a broken arm once, pulled a bullet out twice. Once with proper tools, once with a pocket knife and whiskey." He was quiet for a moment. "Whose bullet?" First time a rancher who'd been in a dispute with his neighbor and didn't want anyone official knowing about it. "Second time." She paused. "Second time was my father. He shot himself in the leg cleaning a rifle drunk. He made me promise never to tell anyone." Something moved through Elias's expression. "You kept that promise." "It wasn't for him," she said. "It was because the truth would have embarrassed him, and embarrassed men drink more." She closed the tin. "I was 17. The silence that followed was different from their usual silences. It had weight. "Clara," he said, "don't." She stood up. "I'm not telling you that for sympathy. I'm telling you so you understand that I've been managing difficult situations by myself for a long time, and I'm very good at it, and you don't have to pretend the cut wasn't as bad as it was." He looked up at her. "I wasn't going to offer sympathy," he said. "I was going to say thank you." She stopped. "For the stitches," he added. "And for not making it strange." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the bloody cloth from the basin and walked to the back door to shake it out in the snow, and she kept her face turned away because she didn't want him to see what had just happened to her expression, which was something she didn't have a word for yet. The days built on each other after that. There was a rhythm to life in the cabin that Clara found herself settling into without deciding to early mornings, the trap lines, the animals, the cooking, the long evenings where they sat on opposite sides of the fireplace, and Elias sharpened tools or mended gear, while Clara read from her mother's Bible, or worked on the dried herb stores she was cataloging. They talked sometimes. Not always. But when they talked it was real, and that was rarer than people understood, and Clara understood it better than most. She learned things about him the way you learn a landscape gradually, by traveling across it, repeatedly. He had a younger brother somewhere in Wyoming he didn't speak about in present tense. He'd fought at Gettysburg and come back different, which was the politest way anyone had ever described what that battlefield left in a man. He couldn't read not well anyway enough to get by, but he'd taught himself mostly, and there were gaps, and he was quietly ashamed of it, in the way that intelligent people are ashamed of the things circumstance stole from them before they had a say in the matter. "I can teach you," Clara said one evening. She said it without looking up from her Bible. "I get by," he said. "I know. I'm not saying you can't. I'm saying I can teach you." A long pause. "Why?" She looked up then. "Because you're smart enough that the gaps must be frustrating. And because we're going to be here a long time, and there's not a lot else to do in the evenings." He looked at her steadily. Then he picked up the mending he'd set down and went back to it. "All right," he said, like it was nothing, like he hadn't just agreed to something that cost him something to say yes to. She started teaching him the next evening. He learned faster than she expected, which surprised her, and then it didn't, because she'd been watching him for weeks, and she knew by now that Elias Boone was a great deal more than what the outside of him advertised. 2 weeks into January. The snow came down hard and serious, and settled in for what felt like forever. They were inside for 3 days straight, and on the second day, Clara was in the kitchen, and Elias was somewhere above her on the roof, checking a section that had been worrying him. And she heard him shout one sharp word, and then silence, and then a sound like something giving way. She was at the back door before she'd decided to move. Elias was on the ground beside the woodpile, one knee down. The expression on his face, the controlled blankness of a man working very hard not to show pain. "Your ankle," she said, already crouching. "My shoulder. I caught myself wrong." She put her hands on his shoulder, feeling carefully. He hissed once through his teeth. "It's not dislocated," she said. "But you've torn something. Can you stand? Yes. Then stand slowly and let me help you inside. I don't need Elias. Her voice was firm and quiet. Let me help you inside. He stood slowly and let her take some of his weight through the door, which she knew cost him, and she pretended not to notice the way his pride flexed and went rigid about it. She strapped his shoulder and made him sit still and drink the willow bark tea she prepared, and he hated every minute of it, in the way that capable men hate being still. But he did it, and after an hour, the worst of the pain had backed off, and he sat at the table across from her with the tea in his good hand, and looked at her with that particular look he sometimes got. What? She said. Nothing, he said. You're doing the thing where you look like you're thinking something you're not going to say. He blinked. You noticed that? I notice most things. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I was thinking that my mother would have liked you. Clara went very still. She was practical like that, he said. No performance about it, just capable. He turned the cup in his hand. She died when I was 19. Fever. I'm sorry, Clara said. She used to say that the women who look soft are often the hardest inside, and the women everyone calls difficult are usually just the ones who refuse to lie about what they were. He looked up. I didn't understand it at the time. I think I do now. Clara held his gaze. Her chest was doing something she wasn't prepared for. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman, she said. She was, he said. You'd have gotten along. Clara looked down at the table. She pressed her thumbnail against the wood grain and focused on that until her face was back under her control. Finish your tea, she said. The willow bark needs to sit in you for another 20 minutes before it does any good. He almost smiled. She heard it in his silence. That night, lying in her room with the wind hammering the walls, Clara pulled out the letter she'd written to herself at 25 and opened it for the first time in years. She had written, I want someone to see me. Not what they think I should be or what they wish I were. Just me. Exactly as I am. I don't think that's too much to ask, and I don't know why it feels like it is. She read it twice. Then she folded it back up and put it in her Bible between two pages she would remember, and she lay back and stared at the ceiling while the storm worked itself out against the walls of the cabin, and she thought about a man who'd said, you'd have gotten along like she was already part of something, like she was already real to him in a way that had nothing to do with what she looked like, or what she weighed, or what the town had decided about her worth. And she thought about how strange it was that the worst night of her life, the night her father set the timer, had put her inside a place where someone looked at her and saw exactly what was there. She still didn't cry. But she pressed her hand flat against the wall again, feeling the solid weight of it, and she thought, this is real, and I'm in it. The wolf came on a Tuesday. Clara heard the commotion from the barn, the horses going sharp and anxious, a sound she'd learned to read in the 2 weeks she'd been here, and she got to the barn before Elias, because his shoulder was still strapped, and she'd heard her moving faster. She had the lantern in one hand, and she pushed through the barn door into the dark and cold. And there it was, a large gray wolf near the back corner close to the stall where Elias kept his best horse, a black mare named Dusk, who was currently throwing her head and pulling hard at her lead. Clara stopped. The wolf looked at her. She looked at the wolf. The wolf was thinner than it should be for January, and one of its back legs was wrong, somehow held wrong, favoring the left. She registered all of this in the time it took to draw one breath, and in the same breath she registered that there was no threat display, no raised hackle, no bared teeth. The wolf was not hunting. It was cold and hurt and confused about how it had gotten itself into an enclosed space with a panicking horse. Clara took one slow step to her right, then another, positioning herself between the wolf and Dusk's stall without moving toward either of them, with the lantern held low and still. Hey, she said softly to the wolf. Hey. Easy. Elias appeared in the barn doorway behind her. She heard him stop. Clara, he said very quietly. Don't move. I'm not moving, she said just as quietly. Neither is she. Look at her leg. A pause. I see it. She's not here to hurt anyone. She's confused and she's hurt, and the horse scared her when she came in looking for warmth. Clara kept her voice very low and steady. Dusk needs to stop moving. Can you settle her from there? Yes. A pause, and she could hear him moving to the left of the doorway, away from the wolf's sightline toward Dusk's stall from the far side. His voice went low and certain in the particular register he used with the horses, and Dusk began to slow her thrashing. The wolf turned its head to follow the movement. Clara took one step forward slowly and set the lantern on the ground, and then she took off her coat and held it out to the side, not toward the wolf, just off to the side, giving the wolf a wider picture of her, giving the wolf a way to understand that she was large and present and not afraid. There's a way out on your right, she told the wolf, because she believed that something in the tone carried even when the words didn't. You can go. No one's going to stop you. The wolf looked at her for a long moment. Then it turned slowly and walked along the far wall of the barn and through a gap in the boards near the back that Clara hadn't even known was there. And then it was gone, and the barn was quiet, except for Dusk's breathing settling back to normal. Clara picked up her coat and her lantern. Elias was standing in the middle of the barn, looking at her with an expression she couldn't categorize. She'd seen most of his expressions by now, the flat, careful one, the almost smile, the one that meant he was deciding something. But this one was different. This one was the face of a man who had just seen something he hadn't expected to see and was recalculating from the ground up. That was, he started. She comes around sometimes, doesn't she? Clara said. The wolf with the bad leg. Yes, he said, but she's never come inside before. She's getting more desperate. The winter's been hard. Clara checked on Dusk briefly, running a hand down the mare's neck. You should put a proper board over that gap, but maybe leave a small space, something she can get her head through without coming all the way in. Elias said nothing for a moment. Why? He said. Because she needs somewhere to shelter, and she's been coming to you for the meat, which means she trusts this place. Clara turned to face him. You don't abandon things that trust you just because they make things complicated. That's what you said about Patterson. Elias looked at her in the lantern light for so long that she started to feel the weight of it. What? She said. Nothing, he said. Again. Elias. I was wrong about something, he said quietly. That's all. Wrong about what? He picked up a piece of gear from the wall and turned it in his hands. When your father came to me, he said, with the arrangement, I agreed because I needed someone who could manage the cabin, and I figured anyone would be better than nothing. He set the gear back on its hook. I was wrong about that. I didn't need anyone. I needed someone specific. He looked up. I just didn't know what specific looked like until now. Clara's heart did something she hadn't given it permission to do. She walked past him toward the barn door, into the cold, and she kept walking until she was back at the cabin door and through it, and standing in the kitchen with both hands flat on the table breathing. He'd said it like a simple thing, like a fact he was reporting. With no idea, she was almost certain what it had just done to her. She pressed both hands harder into the table and made herself breathe slowly, and outside, the wind picked up again, and the mountains sat enormous and dark all around the cabin. And somewhere in the tree line, a wolf with a bad leg was making her way back into the cold, and Clara stood in the warm kitchen of a home she hadn't chosen, and felt for the first time in 31 years like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. And that terrified her in a way no winter ever had. She didn't sleep that night, not because she was uncomfortable, and not because the wind was loud, though it was. She lay in her room with her eyes open and her hands folded on her chest, and she thought about what Elias had said in the barn, the way he'd said it plainly with no decoration, the way he said everything that mattered, and she thought about how a person could spend 31 years being invisible and then walk into a mountain in January and find someone who looked directly at her and saw something worth keeping. It was too much. It was too fast. She didn't trust it. She'd learned early that hope was the most dangerous thing a woman in her position could carry, because hope was the thing people used against you. They gave you just enough of it to keep you compliant, and then they reminded you what you actually were, and the distance between those two things was where the real damage happened. Clara had scar tissue in that distance. She wasn't interested in adding to it, so she made herself a rule. There in the dark, listening to the wind, she would be useful, and she would be fair, and she would not let herself want anything she couldn't build with her own two hands. That was the only safe way to do this. She had that rule for exactly 4 days before everything changed. It started with strangers. Elias came back from the lower trap lines on a Thursday morning, moving faster than usual, and Clara knew something was wrong before he got through the door, because she'd learned the difference between his normal stride and the one he used when something required immediate attention. 2 men in the valley, he said, pulling off his coat. On company horses. What company? Halcott Mining. He went to the window and stood to the side of it, looking down toward the tree line. They've been circling the lower boundary for 3 days. I've been watching them. You didn't say anything. I was hoping they'd move on. Clara came to stand beside him, also to the side of the window, also watching. They didn't. No. His jaw was set. Halcott's been buying up mountain land south of here for 6 months, paying low, threatening high. 3 families sold in September. 2 held out and found their outbuildings burned by December. He paused. The copper vein everyone knows about runs north, right under this property. How much is the land worth to them? Enough that they've sent lawyers twice already. I told both of them the same thing. Which was, that this land belonged to my grandfather and will belong to my children and is not for sale at any price. Clara absorbed that. Children, she said carefully. He turned from the window and looked at her directly. I meant it as a general statement. I know, she said. A pause stretched between them that had things in it neither of them addressed. What do they do, Clara said, when the lawyers don't work? His silence answered her. She went to her herb tin without another word and started reorganizing it with the focused efficiency of someone preparing for something. And Elias watched her do it and didn't ask what she was doing because he already understood, and that understanding, that wordless recognition between two people who were starting to think in the same direction, sat between them like something warm that neither of them acknowledged. The first knock came 2 days later. Clara was alone in this cabin when it happened. Elias was checking the upper trap lines and wouldn't be back until midday, and she was at the table working through one of the reading exercises she'd been preparing for their evening lesson, when a fist hit the door 3 times hard, with the particular rhythm of men who don't expect to be kept waiting. She didn't hesitate. She closed the book, stood up, and went to the door and opened it. 2 men stood on the porch. Both wore good coats and bad expressions. The one in front was tall and smooth-faced, with the look of a man who'd been educated somewhere that didn't include manual labor, and the one behind him was broader and quieter. The kind of quiet that meant he was the answer to whatever problem the smooth-faced one couldn't solve with words. Mrs. Boone. The smooth-faced one smiled like he'd practiced it. My name is Gerald Pruitt. I represent the Halcott Mining Corporation. Is your husband available? No, Clara said. When do you expect him back? When he gets here. Pruitt's smile adjusted. Perhaps you and I could speak in the meantime. As his wife, you'd certainly have an interest in Mr. Pruitt, Clara said. Whatever you're about to say to me, that you hope I'll carry back to my husband, I'd encourage you to save it. I'm not a messenger, and I'm not a lever. Pruitt blinked. He hadn't expected that. Men like Pruitt never expected it. I was simply going to say, he said more carefully now, that Halcott's offer for this property is extraordinarily generous. Enough to set up a family very comfortably in a proper town with proper amenities. Surely that's worth considering. My husband said no twice to your lawyers, Clara said. That's not a negotiating position, that's an answer. With respect, his wife might see the situation differently. His wife, Clara said, grew up on a ranch in Montana and has been managing difficult men her entire life. You're not offering us generosity, Mr. Pruitt. You're offering us the price of going away quietly, and we both know what happens to the people who don't take it. She looked at the broader man behind him. I see you brought a demonstration. I want you both off this porch in the next 30 seconds. Pruitt's smile disappeared entirely. What replaced it was less pleasant. Mrs. Boone, I hope you'll reconsider the tone. 20 seconds, Clara said. They left. Not gracefully, but they left. Clara closed the door and stood with her back against it and let out a slow breath, and her hands were not shaking, which surprised her a little, and she thought about that for a moment before she went back to the table and the reading exercise and the hour she had left before Elias came home. She didn't tell him what she'd said immediately. She waited until supper, and then she told him the whole thing plainly, and she watched his face go through something complicated. "You told them to leave," he said. "Yes." Pruitt's not used to being told to leave. That was apparent. Elias set down his fork. He looked at her across the table with that expression she'd started to recognize as the one that meant he was about to say something real. "Clara, these men are not, they don't stop. I know. You know what they did to the Kellerman property in December. You told me. And you're not—" He paused. "You're not frightened." "Of course I'm frightened," she said. "I'm not stupid. But being frightened and being stopped by it are two different things, and I've never had the luxury of letting them be the same." She picked up her fork. "We need to think about what comes next. Because Pruitt's going to go back and report that the wife is as unmovable as the husband, and whoever makes decisions for Halcott is going to decide they need a different approach." Elias was quiet for a moment. "I've been writing to the county marshal for 2 months," he said. "He hasn't responded." "Then we write to someone higher." She met his eyes. "And in the meantime, we make sure this cabin is harder to get into than it looks." He stared at her. "You want to fortify the cabin." "I want to be ready," she said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes. Ready means we choose the terms. Fortified means we're scared. I'm not scared. I'm prepared." He looked at her for a long time. Then something settled in his face. Something that had been tight for days, she realized, and she hadn't quite read it right until now, and he said very quietly, "My grandfather built this cabin to last 100 years. "Then let's make sure it gets the chance," she said. The next week was sharp-edged and purposeful. They checked every window latch, reinforced the bar on the back door, moved the second rifle to a place Clara could reach it without crossing the main room, and Elias taught her how to load it properly, standing behind her in the kitchen while she practiced until she could do it in the dark without thinking. He was careful not to touch her during the lessons, and she was careful not to notice how careful he was, and both of them were aware of exactly how close they were standing, and neither of them said a word about it. On a Saturday evening 2 weeks after Pruitt's visit, a rider came up the mountain trail at dusk. Elias was on the porch when he came, and Clara came out behind him, and they stood together watching, and the rider turned out to be a boy of about 16, from the Kellerman farm, breathing hard and scared. "Mr. Boone," the boy said, "my father sent me. He says you need to know Halcott hired men, not lawyers, men. They're asking about your property in town." Elias stepped off the porch and took the horse's bridle to steady it. "How many men?" Lyle Fenn saw 3. "Could be more." The boy swallowed. "They're not from here. My father says they don't have the look of men who care about warrants." "Your father's right." Elias reached into his coat and produced 2 coins and held them up to the boy. "You go straight home. You tell your father I said thank you, and I said to keep his family close to the house for the next few weeks." The boy took the coins and looked at Clara, who nodded at him. "Go fast," she said, "and don't stop in town." He went. Clara and Elias stood on the porch in the cold watching him go, and when the sound of the horse faded, neither of them moved for a moment. 3 men, Clara said. "At least." "When do you think they'll come?" "Not in daylight," he said. "Men who don't care about warrants don't like witnesses." Clara thought about this with the same methodical calm she'd applied to everything since January. "I can shoot," she said. "You know that." "I know." "Then we decide right now what we're willing to do." She turned to face him. "Because I need to know what kind of fight this is before it starts, not in the middle of it." He turned to face her too. They were closer than they usually stood, and neither of them stepped back. The cold was sharp, and the dark was coming down fast over the mountains, and somewhere in the trees something moved, and neither of them looked away from each other. "The kind where we protect what's ours," he said. Clara registered the word ours, and did not let it show on her face. "All right," she said. Then let's make sure we're ready." They were not ready enough. It came at 2 in the morning on a night when the temperature had dropped hard and fast and the snow was coming sideways. Which was why Clara was still awake. She'd been listening to the wind change, and something in its quality had felt wrong to her. Not weather wrong, but something else wrong. And she'd lain in her room for an hour before she finally got up and put her clothes on in the dark. She smelled the smoke before she heard anything. Not wood smoke. Something else. Something chemical and wrong and deliberate. She was across the room and at the door in 2 steps, and she yanked it open, and the hallway below the stairs was orange. Elias. She went down the stairs faster than was safe, and hit the bottom, and the smoke was already thick and low and wrong. Elias. He came through the kitchen doorway, coughing one hand over his face, and she grabbed his arm, and he grabbed her back, and for a disoriented second, they both stood in the burning hallway, trying to understand the geometry of the fire. "Back door," she said. "There are men outside. Front door's already gone," she said, because she could see it was the fire was concentrated at the front of the cabin, the porch, the front wall. Someone had used something accelerant and deliberate and targeted. Back door now. They moved together through the kitchen, low under the smoke, and Elias hit the back door with his shoulder, and it opened, and the cold air hit them like a wall. And then Clara heard the sound. A man's voice shouting something she couldn't make out, and then Elias was hit. She didn't see how. She heard the impact and felt him stagger against her, and then he was down one knee on the ground, and there was blood on the side of his head, catching the orange firelight, and Clara had exactly 1 second to make a decision. She made it. She reached back through the open door to the peg beside the kitchen entrance, where the rifle hung, the one they'd moved, the one she'd practiced loading in the dark until she could do it without thinking, and she had it in her hands before she was fully upright, and she pulled back the hammer and stepped in front of Elias and raised it toward the dark. 3 shapes in the snow. 2 of them stopped moving when they saw the rifle. The third one didn't. Clara fired, not at the man. Above him. Close enough that the sound was enormous in the winter silence, and the snow kicked up a foot from his left boot, and he stopped. All 3 of them stopped. Her hands were shaking now. She noticed that. She didn't lower the rifle. "The next one doesn't go above," she said. Her voice was steady. She was astonished by how steady it was. "You have about 45 seconds before I decide which one of you deserves it most. I would use them to run." They ran, not gracefully, not all at once. But they ran, and then they were gone into the dark, and the snow, and the sound of her own heartbeat was the loudest thing in the world. She lowered the rifle. Her legs wanted to give out. She didn't let them. She turned around and dropped to her knees beside Elias, who was conscious and trying to get up and bleeding from a cut above his ear that was worse than it looked, which was saying something because it looked bad. "Stay down," she said. The cabin is burning. We can't stop it. Stay down and let me look at your head." "Clara." "Elias." She put both hands on either side of his face and made him look at her, and his eyes were tracking and present, and she felt something in her chest release. "I need you to let me look at your head. Can you do that?" He looked at her. His hands came up and covered hers, both of them just for a moment, holding her hands against his face, and she felt the warmth of them even through the cold. "Yeah," he said. "I can do that." Behind them the cabin burned. Everything they'd built in those weeks, the reading exercises on the table, the herb tin she'd reorganized, her mother's Bible, all of it going up in orange and heat, and the particular smell of a life being unmade. Clara didn't look at it. She kept her eyes on Elias and her hands on his face, and she thought, "We are alive, and that is the only thing that matters right now, and everything else can be rebuilt. Everything else can be remade, and some things cannot, and we still have them. We still have them." And she held on to that with both hands, the way she'd held on to everything worth keeping her entire life, quietly, without ceremony, with the full force of everything she was. How was shivering now. She pulled off her coat and put it around him without discussion, and he opened his mouth to argue, and she gave him a look, and he closed it again. "The barn," he said. "The barn didn't catch. I checked the angle of the fire, it's upwind." He looked at her. "You checked the angle." "Someone had to." "While you were firing a rifle at 3 men." Before, she said. While I was deciding. He stared at her for a long moment, lit orange by the burning cabin behind her. And something happened in his face that she had not seen there before. Not the small, careful expressions she'd catalogued over the weeks, not the almost smile, not the flat, controlled steadiness. Something that had no control in it at all. Something that looked, she thought, like a man watching the last wall he'd built around himself come down. "Clara," he said, "don't." She said the same word she'd said to him on that first morning about sympathy, and she meant the same thing, not because she didn't want it, but because she wasn't ready. She was never ready. She didn't know how to receive it. She had spent 31 years making herself not need it, and she could feel every year of that work straining right now at its seams. "I'm not offering sympathy," he said, exactly as he had before. She went still. "I'm telling you," he said, "that I have never in my life seen anything like what you just did." She looked at him. The fire crackled behind her, and the snow came down around both of them, and the night was enormous. "I was terrified," she said. "I know." He held her gaze. "That's what made it everything." Clara pressed her lips together. She looked up at the sky for a moment, at the snow coming down, and she thought about 31 years of being told what she was, and what she wasn't, and what she'd never be. Then she looked back at him. "Can you walk?" she said. "Yes." "Then let's get to the barn and get warm," she said. "And then we're going to figure out what comes next." She helped him up. His hand stayed in hers longer than was strictly necessary for balance, and she let it. They walked toward the barn together through the snow, the burning cabin at their backs, and neither of them let go. The barn was cold, but it was standing, and that was enough. Clara got Elias settled on a pile of clean straw, with both saddle blankets over him, and the lantern close enough to give warmth without risk. And then she cleaned the cut on his head properly with water from the barn's water pail, and strips torn from the hem of her underskirt. Because her medical tin was ash, now along with everything else, and you work with what you have. She'd been working with what she had her entire life. "Hold still," she said. "I am holding still." "You're holding still while also trying to see what I'm doing, which means you keep moving your head. I want to know how bad it is." "It's bad enough to require stitches and not bad enough to worry about. Now hold still." He held still. She worked quickly, using the needle and thread from her coat pocket she'd taken to keeping a small sewing kit there in the weeks since arriving, old habit from the ranch, and he didn't make a sound through any of it, which she'd expected by now. And when she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at her work in the lantern light. "You'll have a scar," she said. "I already have scars. One more then." She wiped her hands on the straw. "Can you feel your fingers and toes?" "Yes." "Any blurring in your vision?" "No." "Nausea?" "Clara." He looked at her directly. "I'm all right." "I know you are," she said. "I'm asking anyway." He held her gaze for a moment, and then something in him eased that particular tightness he carried in his shoulders when he was in pain and trying not to show it, and he leaned his head back against the barn wall and closed his eyes. "No nausea," he said. "Vision's clear. Fingers and toes accounted for. Good." She moved to sit beside him close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and she pulled one of the blankets to cover both of them without comment, and he didn't comment either. Outside, the fire was still going. She could see the orange flicker under the barn door, and she could smell it, and she made herself not think about what was in there burning. The Bible, the reading exercises, the letter she'd tucked between the pages. She made herself not think about it with the same discipline she applied to everything else that hurt too much to look at directly. "I'm sorry about your mother's Bible," Elias said. She turned to look at him. His eyes were still closed. "How did you know about the Bible?" she said. "I saw you with it, most evenings." A pause. The cover was worn down to almost nothing. Someone had read it a great many times. Clara looked at her hands. "She read it every night," she said. "Every single night of her life that I knew her. And then I did." "I'll get you another." "It won't be the same." "No," he said. "It won't. I'm sorry." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "The letter was in there too." "What letter?" She thought about whether to say it. Then she decided that a woman who'd fired a rifle at 3 men in the dark could probably manage honesty. I wrote it to myself when I was 25. About what I wanted. Things I'd stopped expecting to have. She paused. I'd kept it 6 years. He opened his eyes and looked at her. What did it say? That I wanted someone to see me. She kept her voice flat and careful. The real me. Not the fat woman who scared off decent men, not the useful one who fixed things when they broke. Just me. She looked at the barn door. I never sent it to anyone because there wasn't anyone to send it to. The silence that followed had the quality of something being handled very gently. You don't need it anymore, Elias said. She turned to look at him. His eyes were steady on hers. The thing you wrote it for, he said. You don't need the letter anymore. Clara pressed her lips together hard. She looked away. She stared at the barn door for a long time while the fire flickered under it, and the horses shifted quietly in their stalls, and dusk made a low sound somewhere behind them. Get some sleep, she finally said. I'll keep watch. Clara, I'm not arguing with you about this, Elias. Your head is injured and it's 2 a.m. Sleep. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Wake me in 2 hours and I'll take over. Fine. Promise me. She looked at him. I promise. He closed his eyes again, and within 20 minutes, his breathing had evened out in the way of someone truly asleep, and Clara sat beside him in the cold, with his shoulder pressed against hers, and kept her eyes on the door, and her hands folded in her lap, and thought about what he'd said. You don't need it anymore. She thought about that for a long time. Dawn came gray and cold and honest, the way Montana dawns do, and the cabin was a ruin of black timbers and ash that steamed faintly in the winter air, and Elias stood looking at it with his hands at his sides and his jaw set, and Clara stood beside him and looked too. There was a long silence. Well, he said. Well, she agreed. He turned to look at her. The stitches above his ear were holding. He looked tired in the bone-deep way of a man who'd been through too many nights like this, though he'd told her once that he'd thought those nights were behind him. I'm going to need help rebuilding, he said. I know. The Kellermans will come, and the Hansons from the North Ridge, and old McCarthy probably if his back is holding. That's 4 families, Clara said. You think they'll come through the winter for this? Yes. He said it without hesitation. Because this isn't just about us. If Halcott burns out the Boone property, every piece of mountain land north of Hargrove is next. They know that. He looked back at the ruin. They've been waiting to see if someone would hold. Clara thought about that. Then we hold, she said. He looked at her sideways. You're not angry, he said. About all of this, the arrangement, the fire, all of it. She considered that seriously. I'm furious, she said. I'm furious at Halcott, and I'm furious at Pruitt, and I am furious about the Bible, and the herb tin, and the reading exercises, and the fact that someone thought they could burn down something we built and make us small enough to walk away. She paused. But I'm not angry at you, and I'm not angry at the mountain, and I'm not interested in spending the energy I need for rebuilding on anything that doesn't move us forward. He stared at her. What? She said. Nothing. He shook his head once carefully because of the stitches. Let's get to work. The Kellermans came the same day, which meant someone had seen the fire from the valley, and word had traveled fast, the way it does in mountain communities, where everyone understands that your neighbor's disaster is a preview of your own. Mr. Kellerman arrived with his 2 grown sons and a wagon full of timber, and his wife came with a covered pot of something that smelled like chicken and root vegetables. And she took one look at Clara, standing in the ash of what had been the kitchen, and pulled her into a hug with the directness of a woman who doesn't ask permission before offering comfort. Clara stiffened. Then she let it happen. I heard you ran off 3 of Halcott's men with a rifle, Mrs. Kellerman said, stepping back and looking at her with something that was unmistakably respect. 1 shot above their heads, Clara said. They made their own decision about leaving. 1 shot. Mrs. Kellerman repeated. In the dark, with your husband down. He wasn't down for long. Clara. The older woman took her by both arms. Do you understand what you did? I did what needed doing. In this county, Mrs. Kellerman said, there are men who've been trying to stand up to Halcott for 2 years and haven't managed it. You're a woman who's been on this mountain 5 weeks. Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. The Hansons arrived by noon. Old McCarthy by mid-afternoon back and all. By sundown there were 11 people working on the Boone property, and Clara found herself not standing apart from it, but inside it, handing up boards, passing tools, holding measurements, translating between what Elias planned and what the timber they had could actually do. And somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, Mrs. Kellerman's youngest daughter cut her hand badly on a saw edge, and Clara dealt with it quickly and cleanly, while everyone watched, and after that several people looked at her differently. The next morning, a woman she didn't know rode up from the valley with a sick child across her saddle. I heard about what you did for the Kellerman girl, the woman said. My boys had a fever for 4 days. Clara looked at the child, pale, breathing fast. The particular stillness of a child who'd been sick long enough to stop fighting it, and she looked at the woman's face, which had the look of someone who had been frightened for 4 days straight and was down to her last option. Bring him inside, Clara said. Inside being the barn, which was what they had. And tell me everything he's eaten and drunk since the fever started. She was up all night with the boy. She had no tin, no dried herbs, nothing she'd brought from home, but she had 48 hours of knowledge about what grew on this mountain in winter. And she'd been paying attention on every trapline walk she'd done with Elias, and she sent one of the Kellerman boys out at first light with a description of 3 plants and a location and very specific instructions, and by noon she had what she needed. The fever broke the next morning. The woman wept so hard she couldn't speak for 5 minutes, and Clara sat across from her and let her, and didn't say anything about what it cost to keep her hands in her lap and not reach for the woman, because she'd learned early that people in grief sometimes needed to be witnessed rather than touched, and witnessing was something Clara had always been able to do. What do I owe you? The woman finally said. Nothing, Clara said. Tell me your name and come back if the fever returns. The woman's name was Ruth Albright, and she told everyone in the valley below, and the week after that there were 2 more people at the barn, and the week after that there were 4. Elias watched all of this. He didn't say much about it, but she'd learned by now that the things he didn't say were often the loudest. On a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the fire, he came into the barn where she was reviewing what she'd managed to restock of her herb supply, and he set something on the crate beside her. A book. She picked it up. A Bible newer than her mother's, the leather still stiff, the pages unworded by years of hands. She looked up at him. It's not the same, he said. No. She ran her thumb along the spine. Thank you. There's something in it. He said it carefully, like he was handling something fragile. Page 12. She opened to page 12. There was a folded piece of paper tucked in the gutter of the binding, and she took it out and unfolded it, and she read it. It was a letter. His handwriting, which she knew now from the reading lessons, still slightly careful, still slightly effortful, the handwriting of a man who'd taught himself late. Not long. 11 lines. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and held it in both hands and looked at the barn wall for a long time. Elias, she said. You don't have to say anything, he said quickly. I know I don't. She turned to face him. But I want to. She looked at him steadily. This man she'd been handed to like a debt payment. This man who'd given her a warm room and a choice and a letter written in his own careful hand. I came up this mountain certain that I knew exactly what I was. I'd spent 31 years being told, and I believed most of it. Not all of it, but most. She paused. You made me remember the parts I'd stopped believing. He looked at her. That's not a small thing, she said. I don't have a big enough word for what that is. Clara. I'm not finished. She held his gaze. Whatever this is between us, I don't know the right name for it yet. But I know it's real, and I know I'm not afraid of it anymore, and I know that wherever you build next, I want to be in it. A pause. Not because I was traded there, because I'm choosing it. The quiet that followed was the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Then the barn door opened, and McCarthy's head came around the frame. Boone, The Kellerman boys found something in the east tree line you need to see. Looks like one of Halcott's men left something behind when they ran. Elias didn't look away from Clara immediately. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he said, "Be right there." I went. Clara stood in the barn, with the letter in her hands, and the Bible open to page 12, and listened to his footsteps cross the frozen ground, and thought about the word choosing. About how different it felt in her chest, from every arrangement, every obligation, everything she'd ever done, because there was no alternative. It felt she decided like breathing after a long time underwater. What McCarthy's men had found in the tree line changed everything. One of the three men who'd fled had dropped something in his panic, a leather satchel half buried in the snow that had since frozen solid around its contents. Elias brought it inside and thawed it by the fire and opened it, and inside were documents. Papers with Halcott letterhead. Survey maps with the Boone property outlined in red. And tucked between two folded letters, a payment record in Gerald Pruitt's handwriting with 3 names listed and amounts beside them. Elias looked at the papers for a long time. Then he handed them to Clara. She read through them quickly, efficiently, the way she read everything. "This is evidence of payment for the arson," she said. "Yes." Pruitt signed it himself. "Yes. That man is either very confident or very stupid." "Both," Elias said. "Men like Pruitt assume the evidence won't survive because the people won't survive to present it." Clara set the papers down carefully. "We need to get these to someone who can't be bought." "There's a federal marshal in Helena," Elias said. "He's not county. Halcott doesn't have reach there, not yet." "How long to get to Helena in this weather?" 4 days, maybe 5. "Then we need to send someone trustworthy." She looked up. "Kellerman. His oldest boy. He's steady, and he doesn't talk." Elias looked at her. "You thought of Kellerman before I did." "I've been thinking about contingencies since Pruitt left this porch," she said. "Someone had to." He almost smiled, but the situation was too serious for smiling all the way, so it stayed at the almost. "I'll talk to Kellerman tonight." "Good." She picked up the papers and squared them against each other. "And Elias." "Yeah." "When this is done," she said, "we're building the new cabin with stone on the ground floor." He looked at her. "Harder to burn," she said. I was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Stone on the ground floor," like he was confirming a construction plan, and that was all. But his voice had something in it that had nothing to do with architecture. Kellerman's boy left for Helena before sunrise the next morning with the satchel wrapped in oilcloth and tied twice, and a letter in Elias's handwriting checked twice by Clara addressed to the federal marshal's office. They watched him go from the barn door, and when the sound of the horse faded, Clara turned back to the work. There was always work. She understood that now, not as a burden, but as a structure, the shape that days take when a life has real weight to it. She treated 2 more patients that week. One of them, a rancher's wife who'd been in labor too long and whose husband had ridden 6 hours through a blizzard because Clara's name had reached him as someone who could be trusted. The baby was born just before midnight. A girl. The rancher's wife named her Clara. Elias heard about it from McCarthy the next day, and he came into the barn where she was working and stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking at her with that expression she'd given up trying to catalog, because it didn't fit any of the categories she'd started with. "What?" she said without looking up. "Nothing," he said. "You're doing the thing again." "I know." He came inside and sat on a crate near where she worked. He stopped. She looked up. "I want to say something," he said, "and I don't know how to say it in a way that sounds like what I mean." "Then say it wrong," she said. "I'll understand." He looked at her. "Everyone who comes to you leaves better than they arrived," he said. "Every single one. And you never make them feel smaller for needing help. You just help them, and then you let them go." He paused. "I've never seen anyone do that. Give like that without holding any of it over people." Clara set down what she was holding. "My mother did it," she said quietly. "Before she died. She was the kind of person who gave and never once asked for it back, and I watched that and I thought, I want to be that. I want to be that when I grow up. She paused. I spent a long time thinking I'd failed at it. Because I was angry, and angry women aren't supposed to be generous. That's wrong, Elias said. I know that now. He leaned forward on the crate with his forearms on his knees and looked at the ground for a moment. I want to tell you something I've never told anyone. She waited. When I came back from the war, he said, I thought the best I could do was not hurt anyone. That was the whole ambition. Just get through the days without adding to the damage. He looked up. I'd given up on anything past that. The barn was very quiet, and then your father came to me with the arrangement, he said. And I told myself I was doing it for practical reasons, and I believed that because I'd gotten very good at believing things that kept me from wanting anything. Elias, I'm not finished, he said, exactly as she had said it to him. You came up this mountain in January in the coat that wasn't warm enough, and you got on that horse without asking for help, and you looked at me in the dark, like you were memorizing the route home, and I thought that woman is not what anyone said she was. He paused. And every single day since then, you have been more than I knew how to prepare for. Clara looked at him for a long time. She thought about the rule she'd made for herself in the dark on the 9th night, useful and fair, and don't want anything you can't build with your own hands. She thought about how she'd held to it carefully with both hands the whole time she was also learning his handwriting and teaching him to read and standing between wolves and horses and burning buildings. She thought about 31 years. Then she let the rule go. Come here, she said. He stood up from the crate and crossed the barn floor, and she stood up from the straw to meet him, and they stood facing each other in the cold lantern light. And she took his face in both her hands, the way she had in the snow outside the burning cabin, and she felt his hands come up and cover hers again, warm even in the cold, and she thought, this is real, and I chose it, and no one traded me here. I know what the letter on page 12 says, she told him quietly. I know, he said. I needed you to hear me say it back. I'm listening, he said, and she told him. Outside, the February wind moved through the pines, and the mountain held them both like it had always intended to. And somewhere in the tree line, a wolf with a bad leg made her careful way toward a barn with a gap in the boards just wide enough for her head, and the stars over Montana came out one by one into the dark, cold, and permanent, and indifferent to everything, except the fact that they were there and had always been there waiting to be seen. Spring came to the Rockies the way it always does, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm day, then 3 cold ones. Snow in the morning, mud by afternoon. The mountain didn't give up winter without a fight, and Clara had come to understand that about this place, the way she'd come to understand most things about it by paying attention and refusing to be surprised. The federal marshal's name was Cord Abernathy, and he arrived in the 2nd week of March on a horse that looked like it had come a long way fast, which it had. He was a compact, quiet man with a gray beard and the eyes of someone who had been lied to professionally for 30 years and had developed a very reliable instinct for the truth. He read through the documents from the satchel at the table in the Kellerman's kitchen, the only interior space large enough to hold everyone who'd gathered. When word spread he was coming, and he read them twice without expression, and then he set them down and looked up. Gerald Pruitt signed these himself, he said. Yes, Elias said. That is one of the stupider things I've seen in 20 years of this work. He didn't expect us to be alive to present them, Clara said. Abernathy looked at her. He'd been looking at her at intervals since he arrived the way people did when they were trying to reconcile the woman standing in front of them with the account they'd been given on the road up. Kellerman's boy had apparently talked during the 4-day ride to Helena. Abernathy seemed to be a man who adjusted his expectations readily when the evidence required it, which put him several steps ahead of most people Clara had known. You're the one who fired the rifle, he said. Once, she said, above their heads. One shot ran 3 hired men off a burning property in the middle of the night. The fire helped, she said. They weren't expecting resistance. Abernathy almost smiled. He picked up the documents again. I'm going to need statements from everyone present that night, and I'm going to need the name of every family that sold to Halcott under duress in the past 6 months. I have a list, Clara said. He looked up. I started keeping it in January, she said. When Elias told me about the Kellerman property, I thought someone might need it eventually. She reached into her coat and produced a folded paper, which she set in front of him. 11 families, dates of sale amounts paid, and the names of the Halcott representatives present at each transaction. The kitchen was very quiet. Abernathy looked at the list for a long moment. Then he looked at Elias. "Your wife keeps a list," he said. "She keeps track of most things," Elias said. "That's the most useful habit I've encountered in this territory in a decade." Abernathy folded the list and put it with the documents. "I'll have arrest warrants for Pruitt and the 3 principals at Halcott's regional office within 30 days. The men who set the fire, do you have descriptions?" "I have 2, Clara said. "The third was behind the others. I can give you what I have." "Do that." She did. Abernathy wrote everything down in a small leather notebook without missing a word, and when she was done, he closed it and looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Boone," he said, "in 30 years, I have had very few witnesses who were this useful." "I was a practical witness," she said. "I was there, and I was paying attention." "Most people aren't," he said, "even when they're there." He left the next morning with the documents, the list and 6 pages of sworn statements, and the kitchen watched him go from the windows with the collective held breath of people who had been waiting a long time for something to move in the right direction. The arrest warrants came in April. Pruitt was taken into federal custody on a Tuesday. The 3 principals at Halcott's regional office were taken the same week. 2 of the men who'd set the fire were found in Billings. The third was never located, which Abernathy relayed in a letter to Elias, with the footnote that the man had reportedly left the territory at speed shortly after the night in question, and showed no signs of returning, which Abernathy considered adequate resolution under the circumstances. The Kellermans gathered everyone who'd sold land to Halcott under duress for a meeting in their barn in May, and Clara sat beside Elias and listened, while Abernathy explained the legal process for challenging the forced sales. And she took notes for the families who couldn't read and answered 3 questions the marshal missed because she'd read through the relevant statutes in a borrowed law book the week before and knew where the gaps were on the walk home. Home being the new cabin, which had been raised in March by 14 people working 4 consecutive Saturdays stone on the ground floor, exactly as Clara had specified. Elias was quiet for a long time, in the particular way that meant he was working toward something. "What?" she said. "Abernathy asked me something before he left this morning," he said. "What did he ask?" "He asked how long we had been married." A pause. "I told him 5 months. He said we seemed like people who'd known each other a great deal longer than that." Clara walked in silence for a moment. "What did you say to that?" "I said some people take longer to find each other and make up for it fast." He glanced at her sideways. He seemed to find that satisfying. "It's a good answer." "I thought so." They walked. The mud of the mountain path was beginning to firm up as May warmed, and the pines smelled like something beginning. And above them, the sky was the particular blue that only exists at altitude, the kind of blue that has nothing to apologize for. "Elias," Clara said. "Yeah. I want to get married again." He stopped walking. She kept walking for 2 steps, and then stopped 2, and turned to face him. I was looking at her with that expression, the one that had no control in it, the one she'd seen first outside the burning cabin by firelight. "We are married," he said. "We were arranged," she said. "By my father. Over a debt." She held his gaze. "I want to do it again, the right way, in front of people, because we chose it." She paused. "If you want that." He looked at her for a long moment. "Clara Bennett," he said slowly, "are you asking me to marry you?" "I believe I am," she said. "Then yes," he said. "Obviously yes." She turned and kept walking, and he fell into step beside her, and neither of them said anything else about it, but the silence had a different quality to it now, lighter somehow, like something that had been held at tension for a long time had finally been allowed to settle. The summer wedding was Ruth Albright's idea. She arrived at the cabin in June with her husband and the daughter she'd named Clara, who was 4 months old and very opinionated about being held, and she sat down at the kitchen table and said, I've been thinking about this since April, and I want to plan it if you'll let me. Clara looked at her. You want to plan our wedding? I want the whole mountain to come, Ruth said. Every family that Halcott tried to push off their land. Every family you've helped. I want it in the meadow below the East Ridge where the wildflowers are thick in July, and I want it to be the kind of celebration this community has needed for 2 years. She looked very directly at Clara. And I want everyone in the valley who said anything unkind about you to stand there and watch you be exactly who you are. Clara was quiet for a moment. That last part isn't necessary, she said. Maybe not for you, Ruth said, but it might be for them. People need to see what they got wrong. It's the only way they learn. Clara looked at the daughter in Ruth's arms. Baby Clara looked back at her with the focused concentration of a 4-month-old encountering a complicated world. All right, Clara said, but keep it simple. Ruth smiled. Simple, she agreed in the tone of a woman who had no intention of keeping anything simple. It was not simple. What Ruth Albright organized across 6 weeks of July was the largest gathering the mountain communities had seen since before the war. 43 families, which was everyone. Which was something no one had managed before because there was always a dispute about something, a boundary or a water right or an old argument. But Ruth had apparently gone around to every single family personally and made a case that whatever the dispute was, it could wait one afternoon, and people found it difficult to say no to Ruth Albright. Clara found out the scale of it the morning of when Elias told her, and she stood in their bedroom in the new cabin in her dark brown dress and looked at him. 43 families, she said. Approximately. That's over 200 people. Probably. Elias. She looked at him steadily. I have spent my entire life trying not to be looked at by large groups of people. He crossed the room and stood in front of her and took both her hands. His were warm and real. I know, he said, but you're not the same woman who came up this mountain in January. I'm exactly the same woman, she said. The same size, the same face, the same... That's not what I mean, he said, and you know it. She looked at him. In January, he said, you were carrying 31 years of other people's opinions about you. You walked in like someone waiting to be told they'd done something wrong. He held her gaze. You don't walk like that anymore. Clara thought about that. She thought about the way she'd stood at the barn door in front of 3 armed men in the dark and held the rifle steady. She thought about the rancher's wife who'd named her daughter after her. She thought about the list she'd kept since January that had helped put Gerald Pruitt in federal custody. She thought about Abernathy's face when he read it. No, she said quietly. I suppose I don't. Then let them look, he said. Let them see who you are. You've earned that. She squeezed his hands once and let go and straightened her dress and looked at him. You need to shave, she said. You look like something Patterson chased through a fence. He laughed. She hadn't heard him laugh, really laugh, unguarded more than twice in the months she'd known him, and it was still startling how much it changed his face, how much younger and less weathered it made him look, and she filed it away in the fragile place and thought, I want to hear that every day. He shaved. She braided her hair the way she liked it, plain and functional, because she had never been a woman who performed femininity for an audience, and she wasn't going to start. She put on her dark brown dress and her good boots, and she picked up the new Bible from the nightstand page. 12 held a different letter. Now one she'd written herself last month and meant to keep forever, and she went downstairs. Elias was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. He'd put on a clean shirt, dark vest, the good coat he reserved for occasions. His hat was in his hand. The scar above his ear from February had faded to something thin and silvery that she sometimes touched without thinking when she was near him. He looked at her coming down the stairs and said nothing for a moment. Ready, he said. Yes, she said. They walked to the meadow together, and the mountain was in full summer, the grasses tall and the wildflowers thick, the way Ruth had promised, and the assembled families of the mountain communities of northern Montana stood waiting in the morning light, and Clara walked toward them beside her husband, with her chin level and her shoulders straight and her hands at her sides, and she did not flinch from a single pair of eyes. She saw Mrs. Kellerman, who had held her on the morning after the fire. She saw McCarthy, whose back had held long enough to help raise the stone walls of their new home. She saw